The following views expressed in this podcast are for educational purposes, and the views and opinions expressed by our guests are not necessarily G4 Health's. We hope you enjoy.
Ambawa Stitch G4 Talk Health Ejabne Yeskabi Chantu Abin Gichibare Da'ao Pinchi Inijayamich Da'a Anartan Da'ina Nartaminchin Ishnish.
Welcome to the G4 Talks Health podcast. This episode, we speak with Calgary Foundation Vice President Tim Fox on walking in two worlds and reconciliation.
Oki Nistoni Taniko Naituisa Kasum. I just shared with you a Blackfoot name that was gifted to me by an elder in my community. So I'm originally from the Blood Reserve. I grew up there. My family comes from the Agape clan, and in English that translates to the Many Children's Clan. The child of residential school survivors and proud father of an 11-year-old daughter.
What does walking in two worlds mean as a First Nations person, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think it means a couple of things. It means different things to different people. But the way I would share how I understand it is also related to the work that I'm doing right now. So, in the last few years, I have noticed that there's this growing interest from a lot of organizations, a lot of settler-led, settler-created organizations right across the country to really find ways to mobilize the work of reconciliation, or reconciliation has become this huge buzzword, in society. And then I think you add on the layer of there's an action being taken through land acknowledgements, and I think society in general is coming to understand the significance behind ancestral lands and treaty territorial acknowledgements and all that kind of stuff. So there's this growing desire and interest not to disclude some external factors that are happening. So what I mean by that is a couple of years ago we heard in mainstream media some challenging situations around Mi'kmaq fishermen trying to access a basic livelihood and then being met with some challenges from settler fishermen accessing fishing rights on their own territories and all that kind of stuff. And then we hear some challenging instances like the grandfather who tried to open up a bank account with his 15-year-old granddaughter in Vancouver, had the police called on him, was arrested. So all of these things we're hearing about, from an external perspective to, the discovery of all these children's remains at residential school sites. This is what society is hearing about. And so then there's this connection happening between all of these challenging situations to why there's such a need for the work of truth and reconciliation. And that work has, really, in my mind, gained a lot of momentum since the release of the report in 2015. And so there's a desire from a lot of settler-led organizations and initiatives to invite people with lived experience to inform what is needed for transformational change, for change that's related to reconciliation and equity and justice and all that kind of stuff. And for the most part, I feel like the responsibility of that work should be the responsibility of everyone. What's happening, though, is Indigenous people are playing a really unique role in that process because we hold these levels of lived experience. And ultimately, the transformation that we need should involve a lot of Indigenous paradigm of thought and practice. I think we're so conditioned as a society to move through life that prioritizes and upholds a Western way of doing life. There's only one acceptable way of doing life, and historically that didn't include Indigenous people or how we valued life and all that kind of stuff. So for me, walking in two worlds is a person being tasked to support a shift and support changes that are needed, in the name of reconciliation and in the name of racial equity. But that requires, like I said, people with a level of lived experience. That requires a level of people who, unfortunately, are still experiencing a lot of these impacts of intergenerational trauma. And here we are, invited into these, for the most part, mainstream organizations or white-led organizations, where we are tasked to sort of guide them through a process of healing and reparation and change. And so that's why I said it really relates to the work that I'm doing right now I'm working for a settler-created philanthropic organization, doing exactly that. I'm trying to design a systems change approach for reconciliation, but I also still come from where I come from, and I shared that in my introduction, that I was raised on the Blood Reserve, and I was raised no differently than anyone else who experiences that life and experiences these challenges of having residential school survivors, be your caregivers and be your parents, where we're still sort of dealing with a lot of challenges and healing from their perspectives. And so, it's still trying to find that connection that was lost to your cultural roots. And thankfully, I think this is true for a lot of First Nations communities, is that the resilience that we have and the way we have been able to have our values survive and our languages survive and thrive despite all these challenges and these efforts of assimilation and genocide. We've overcome a lot. So that's a really beautiful thing about that. We still have really strong connections to our culture and where we come from. And so to me, it's sort of just maintaining a level of balance, because it's exhausting when you're trying to move forward change. And, we're sitting in my office right now, and it's not an easy thing to bring a mainstream organization through a change process like this when you know that you're so impacted by something that's a lot more real. For the mainstream organizations we work with, sometimes this work ends for them, at 4:30 or at the end of a work day. They don't really realize that for us, we have to sort of continue to be who we are and live in our skin, even after we leave the walls of these offices that we are, a part of. So to me, it's a huge responsibility to walk in two worlds like that, and to try to navigate and strive for this change that is so needed. The reason why I do it is because I learn a lot from the elders that I work with. The generosity that these survivors show up with time and time again. Sometimes they show up to tell their stories in detail, and it can't be an easy thing to do. But this conversation around truth is not a new conversation for us. It's a conversation that we've been really working towards for, I would say, decades. And I just lean a lot on their humility, and I think, why am I being so, impacted or negatively impacted, or why am I letting this challenge get to me when I see the strength in these elders that we work with? They're so strong, and they hold so much hope. So I really sort of lean on their experiences to keep me motivated in this work, to keep me motivated in walking in both these worlds.
What are some teachings or ways that people could decolonize not just their work, but just like their life?
I think for me, one of the annual activities that we design is an experience called Active Reconciliation Treaty 7. And coincidentally, it's a 3-day systems retreat that's rooted in reconciliation. And so we host this. We design it every single year. We've been offering it to community and to our colleagues here since 2018. We just ended it last week, so we were in Banff, and it's an experience that requires us to be on the land, learning about theory when it comes to systems change, learning about systems change ideologies and resources, but also paralleled with a lot of Indigenous knowledge and informed by the elders that we're working with and other Indigenous knowledge keepers in the community. So one thing that we invite our participants to do is we send them a welcome and grounding information just to get them into this mindset of being on the land, being in relationship with the land, prioritizing that. So we give them a lot of like pre-reading material that talks about. There's an article written by Leroy Littlebear, and Leroy Littlebear is an elder from my community. He's also an academic who talks about jagged worldviews. In this article he wrote called Jagged Worldviews, he talks about a colonial perspective, but he parallels that to Indigenous value systems and all that kind of stuff. And in this welcome and grounding email that we have our participants thinking about, is the invitation is we ask them to come prepared with a couple of things. The first thing we ask them to prepare for is to share the land acknowledgement, the ancestral and traditional land acknowledgement of the places that they were born. And then we go on to provide a little bit more deeper context to them to say, you know, in the work of truth and reconciliation, we are trying to amplify and mobilize a lot of the facts of the matter. So when we invite people to take a deep dive into shared history about all these things around residential schools, and this, like none of this stuff is made up. So we're always based on the facts, and we remind our participants that the fact of the matter is 100% of land is located on ancestral and traditional territories. So it really doesn't matter what towns or cities they were born in, if they were born in Canada or North America, that these places are located on ancestral and traditional territories. And that comes to a surprise to some of them who haven't stepped into the work before, because they're like, the way society has framed this work is like, you know, we're these historical beings, and the way life existed is all about history. And it wasn't that long ago where we did exist sort of in bioregions, and that these bioregions really inform the diversity that exists with Indigenous nations. Like in southern Alberta here, you know, this would have been the bioregion of the Plains people, and that informed our food sources, how we survive these natural elements. The bioregion of people in the West Coast region is totally different. Their food source is going to be different. The natural resource or the natural elements that they had to survive are a lot different than these harsh cold winters that we have here. So all these things, we begin to invite them to think about this kind of stuff. And that one question, come prepared to share the ancestral and traditional territories that you were born on, opens up this layer upon layer of discovery and wow and realization, where once they do a lot of that work and do a lot of that research at the actual retreat itself, we provide space, time and space to go around and hear exactly what it is that they discovered. And when they introduce themselves, we're less interested to hear about, you know, the positions that they hold for the organizations that they work in. We really challenge them to introduce themselves in a more humanistic way, like, you know, what is your name and what is your social location? What is your identifier when it comes to who you are as a human being? Are you a child, and are you a parent, or are you, you know, what is your relation? Who are your relations around you that you consider important? And that really challenges people who aren't used to that. And then we say, okay, so what is the ancestral and traditional territories? And then they begin to open up to say, well, what I found out is that, you know, I was born on the unceded or traditional territory of so and so and so group, and I've never sort of, you know, discovered that or talked about that. And so then we sort of bring it full circle and we say, you know what, like the practice of acknowledging land should go beyond reading off of a script or trying to get the pronunciation of community names right. As Indigenous people, that's not what we're trying to say. We're trying to encourage and invite people to really build and strengthen a relationship with the very people that they're trying to acknowledge. And frankly, if you haven't done the hard work of that relationship building with the people who are still here today, then you almost haven't earned the right to acknowledge that land. You have to do so much work before that. And so then we connect that back to decolonization, and we just, you know, invite them to think of you just engaged in the process of decolonization when it comes to who you are, just as a really tangible thing. Because I think when people hear, especially mainstream populations, when they hear the word decolonization, the first thing they think of is, what do I have to give up?
Right.
And it's like, That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about experiencing life in this day and age, but also amplifying a different way of knowing, being, and doing, and creating some balance in these scales that are really unbalanced. Because we prioritize what it means to be Canadian, and we prioritize singing the Canadian national anthem. When we acknowledge land, all we're saying is to create some balance and some scales that are really unbalanced. And sing the national anthem and be proud of being Canadian, but in the same breath, acknowledge the original stewards of these lands and these people who are, like I said, still here today.
Right.
We have to sort of eliminate this attitude and belief that Indigenous people need to be erased or assimilated or have to fit into the dominant narrative. And I'm sort of challenging their way of thinking to ask the questions of the systems and the organizations that they're a part of, that those days are gone. And the question you should be asking is, what are you going to do as a system to change?
Is there things that you think people they think that they're being helpful? For example, somebody would say that right, they're asking me about totem poles. They maybe think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think for all people, and I try to encourage this of my settler colleagues, and I also try to encourage it of my Indigenous, kin, my family and my community, is that one thing we all have to realize is that we have been socially and educationally conditioned. We've been socially and educationally conditioned to believe the history books did a good job of painting us with one brush, presenting us to the world, generations before us, our generation now, as one homogeneous group with one set of values, one language source, and all that kind of stuff. That's where that's where the question comes that you get, and sometimes I get as well, is that, well, what is the significance of totem poles? Or even in this day and age, people are coming to me, it's almost like these arrows are coming, the questions are like arrows. And once those questions start, they just don't stop. And they're like, what about Métis people? What about this? What about that?
Yeah.
And so they're coming to me, or coming to the one Indigenous person, because of the way we've been conditioned, and these history books have sort of painted, they think that we hold all the answers. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first thing I would tell settler folks, is to realize that there's diversity within our nations. And that just me identifying from the community that I come from doesn't mean that I hold all the answers, and that I'm still learning along the way. I know what it means to be Nitsitipi from Kainai, and to hold a level of Siksikaitsit to be Blackfoot Confederacy teachings and culture and language. That doesn't mean I know everything about the West Coast First Nations people who hold the totem pole in high regard, and there's probably some significant teachings around what it symbolizes, but that I don't know. Similarly, like when it comes to the Métis community, it's a unique demographic of people that I'm still learning about and still have a lot to learn. So one thing I would want people to know is just that we have been socially and educationally conditioned, and not to enter a dialogue thinking that upholding what I would call a characteristic of white supremacy. And that characteristic of white supremacy is looking at one person as the expert that holds all this knowledge, and that's a white way of thinking, and that's not what we're about. We're about this collective wisdom and this collective knowledge. And we're about strong relationship to land and spirituality that's going to look different nation to nation, depending on where you come from and where you go. So I just want people to be really mindful of that. And then for Indigenous people, to also try to amplify and lean on these values of humility and natural law that our elders sort of live their lives by, and not get so defensive or reactive when we are experiencing these arrows come at us in the form of questions, because it could be really overwhelming. But use that instead as an opportunity to engage in a deeper dialogue. I often tell a lot of my colleagues here that when you're beginning to form a relationship with Indigenous people or communities, you're going to likely experience a level of resistance. You have to realize that that resistance isn't about you as an individual. It's about the system that you represent. And unfortunately, these systems have not been very kind to our communities. So, of course, you're going to experience some criticism on our part to be like, okay, like, what is it that you want? I don't need to be fixed. And how can we work together? And so I try to tell all the people that I work with to look at resistance as a positive thing. Resistance is just an invitation to have a deeper conversation. And there shouldn't be like this negative connotation added to it, because sometimes that fear or that reactive nature from, our community to another community who hasn't been informed at all, that can cause, that's where the harm comes from. So I really just try to lean on these values of humility and generosity from elders and respect. That there's a way to have this kind of conversation and dialogue in a really respectful way. You can present some truth with care, but everyone just needs to be a little bit more patient and kind to themselves and to each other when you're getting into sort of that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. If I wanted to go into the word, the Blackfoot word, if I wanted to explain that, pronounce it.
Sure.
And just explain what that means.
Yeah. So the word is Kimmapiiypitsinni, and what I've been taught is that it loosely translates to kindness and compassion to all things and all people. And so we have, from where I come from Kainai, we have these values, these Kainai values, and there's quite a few of them. One that resonates with me a lot, especially in the work that I do, and in life in general, that I try to live by, is this value of Kimmapiiypitsinni. It's just being, kind to myself, to everyone around me, and in this work, into this work. And I think the reason why that is so significant in my life is because this isn't different from a lot of Indigenous people, that we're not only raised by our parents or, those caregivers around us. We're raised by like our aunts and our uncles and our grandparents and all that kind of stuff. So my grandparents had a huge hand in my upbringing, specifically my grandmother, who, really reminds me of this value where she, raised 11 children on the blood reserve. She was involved in an arranged marriage. So very traditional, and arranged marriages back in that day, they weren't uncommon. Coming from large families wasn't an uncommon thing. But what I really reflect on, and I didn't realize it at the time, was my grandmother was also a janitor at the St. Mary's Residential School. So all of these things that I think about, she, had to have her children at one point attend these institutions like many of our ancestors had to do. Plus she had to work there and then come home at the end of the day, still farm, and then raise all these other children in her life. And I don't ever remember my grandmother being unkind or, just the way she lived her life sort of taught me that it's possible to live this life or really carry and hold on to this value of Kimmapiiypitsinni, just being kind and generous, because she's the most kind person. And I think we all say this about our grandmothers. That's the thing, a lot of people can really relate to that spirit, because I really feel like, although Kimmapiiypitsinni is a Blackfoot word, there's probably similar values in Tsuut'ina culture or other First Nations cultures where it talks about that humility and that compassion, that this value, it's a life value. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what people really need to understand, is that these things really add to our livelihood. That's what was disrupted in all of this shared history. When we talk about the residential school policy, those are the kinds of things that were disrupted because, and I think this is true for a lot of First Nations communities, that the most important people of our community structures were our children. Mm-hmm. And they were gonna make sure that these values that I talk about lived on, survived. They were going to make sure that our languages survived. And that's why we viewed our children to be so sacred. And so when I hear you talk about how elders and survivors do this work for the next generation, I carry that as well, and I try to tell folks like the Calgary Foundation or these organizations that I'm working with, I try to get them to understand that this work is generational, and that this is the reason why we do that. We would be naive to think we're going to experience the significant changes that need to happen in our lifetime. That's not why we do it. That's not why these elders do it. We do it for the benefit of these future generations. And I still struggle with what true reconciliation should look like or could look like, because I honestly don't know. I just know that there's so much work that we need to do generationally right now. And if we do that work right in this generation, we're only going to be setting up the success for the realization of reconciliation is for future generations a lot more seamlessly, because right now we just really struggle with, we grapple with that word, and you know, we just need to come to this understanding that it's generational, and there shouldn't be sort of a timeline associated with the work of reconciliation. It's about the process. For us, in our worldview, it's less about the outcome, but it's more about what is the process and journey that led us to that outcome that we're all sort of striving to get to. I think a common hope and a common belief, regardless of where you come from. You could be a settler, or you could be an Indigenous person. I think at the end of the day, we all want, you know, the best for our children and the children around us. We're all working towards that. So at the end of the day, we share these really similar common core values. We're just going about that work in different ways. For us, it's like the work of indigenization and amplifying and having our ways survive and thrive. And for settler nations, it's about having them understand what it is we're trying to do to get to that same outcome of, you know, a better life, a better world, just better and better. So, yeah.
Right. One of the biggest attempts in our lifetimes is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That I wanted to hear your opinion on it, and what do you think is relevant now, and how you think maybe it should be implemented, or just what do you think about the Truth and Reconciliation the calls to action?
I really like the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I use it as a framework to guide my efforts in the role that I hold right now. So, but more importantly, I think, and I want to invite whoever's listening to this to expand their mind beyond just the TRC, because there's a couple more framing documents that are really important, and I think one of the very first framing documents that I want to sort of amplify and acknowledge that a lot of wisdom and work also went into this, as much, and I don't want to say more, but as much efforts that went into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Report, or RCAP, that ended in 1996. It was released in 1996. It went through a similar process as the TRC to get to that final report status. And similarly to the TRC, the RCAP had tons of recommendations for Canada. It sort of laid out a path forward to address a lot of these challenges that we were facing. And so it had a lot of similar principles in them. I really respect the work of the Truth and Reconciliation, because it does have the voices of these survivors. I participated in, one of the, invitations to come and tell your story of the people. So I know the emotional toll that was involved, and to get to that point, I don't want to say that it was for naught, because I still use it as a guiding document. And then the last framing, work that I want to amplify is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's a minimum standard for the world's governments to make sure that Indigenous people survive and thrive. Going back to the TRC, though, the way I use that as a framework to guide the work that I'm doing is I, took a deep dive into all of the support material that came along with that. And what people have to realize is that there's a really huge sort of executive summary from the TRC way before you get into the calls to action. I think people really narrowed in on these calls to action, And they don't realize that there's a lot of work that has to happen and take place before they even get to those calls to action. And a lot of that work that I have used focuses on this truth-telling movement. But it sort of challenges us to think of ways to do the sense-making. The information is so accessible these days. People can go online and they can find out about truth elements that we're talking about when it comes to residential schools or the 60 Scoop or anything like that. You can find that information out. What people lack is that process of sense-making. They have to really realize that historical context matters. Historical context has shaped the current infrastructure of our society and the organizations that we're a part of right now. Our attitudes and our beliefs have been shaped by the way history has been strategically designed. And that's where a lot of these, so that's what the TRC tells us. That's way before they get into the calls to action. And so right now, and since 2017, I've been taking a deep dive into that first part of that report and really trying to breathe some life into it by having it inform the design work that I do for systems change here at the Calgary Foundation. So that's what I would say about that. And I would tell people just to really not look at these calls to action and then try to, try to address them for sure, but don't make it so performative. There's a lot that you have to do before that. There's a lot of work and understanding that you have to embed within the fabric of how you exist as an organization or as an individual. And if you haven't done that work first, it's going to be more challenging for you to sort of get to a point to facilitate this transformation that the TRC calls for. I don't know if you've heard of like the blanket exercise. A lot of people have heard of. So it's a workshop that was put together by an organization called Kairos, I think out of Ontario. But it's one of the most impactful tools that I've been trained to be a facilitator in, and I've since been mobilizing that experience. What people don't know is that they just know the blanket exercise. It's become very popular and impactful. The blanket exercise emerged from the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People's Report. That's where it comes from.
Wow. Yeah.
So similarly to the TRC, RCAP called on the need for this country to learn about Canadian history from an Indigenous perspective, and so that's where that experience comes from. And so here you have RCAP, and here you have TRC, and here you have all these other reports. There's a common thread and there's a common theme from all these documents, and that calls on all of us to sort of take a deep dive into this truth-telling history, and this truth-telling movement in order to sort of get to that space and that place of transformation and change that we need to experience. First of all, justice and equality for Indigenous people in this country, and now with this new work and this word around reconciliation that I think is also amplifying the need for decolonization and indigenization. So it continues to evolve and evolve and evolve and evolve. What I'm trying to say is that there's a common call to action in all these documents where we have to sort of take that time, first of all, not only to understand this truth, but begin to mobilize that truth. There's this notion of knowledge extraction versus knowledge mobilization that I talk about. When I explain that, I say, historically, Indigenous people have always been extracted from. We've been extracted from in land, in resources, in women, in children, and that extraction continues today. And it's just like take. And in these contemporary times, it has the potential to show up as knowledge extraction. So an organization invites an elder in to inform the work that they're doing, or they invite a leader, or they participate in an online course, simply with the intention to increase their level of understanding. If that's all that they're doing, they're being no less extractive than efforts before them. It's how are they mobilizing what this elder is teaching them? How are they mobilizing what it is I'm sharing with them? How are they mobilizing all that resource, that amazing information that's within that online course to a point of transformation? That's probably requires them to change, that isn't in service of their own comfort. And, if they need to ask themselves, how far am I willing to go to change things so that I'm not comfortable? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about significant changes that are needed.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's like a checkbox for my last question. I always hear 7 generations, or I've heard 8 generation. What do you think it's gonna be 7 generations from now, or what do you hope it would be if we keep doing this work and keep on it?
I'm excited for the evolution that's taking place, and I'm excited for the work that continues to grow in this space. I think it's becoming a huge common conversation in a lot of systems, so that excites me. And I am seeing, although incremental, small shifts and changes, although they are small, there is this growing awareness that's happening, and there's this collective healing that's happening in younger generations and also in older generations as well, where we are really amplifying these values of that help to guide us in this work, because it's not easy work to do. It's very tough and it's very challenging. So I feel like the challenges will continue to exist, but I also see excitement in the way things are shifting and the way things are changing. And I say that because growing up, and I reflect on the children in my life, my nieces, my nephews, my own children around me, that when I reflect on myself at their age, I am nowhere near existing in this world as proud of who I am, and as proud of I see them be of themselves. I carried a lot of shame growing up about being Indigenous and all that kind of stuff, but that's changed totally. Can be more proud of who I am and where I come from, and I see that coming out in this younger generation. So things are changing, things are shifting. For Indigenous people, we just need to really, and I hope that settler nations get up to the same level, and they are, and I see that growth emerging as well. So it's going to be a long while, but I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think that it was worth it, or that change would happen. And so I'm not expecting it to see in my lifetime. That's not why I do this work. I do this work with that same mindset that these elders have, is that it's for these future generations. And we're not raised in this life to on ego or to be self-fulfilling. That's why we do this work, not knowing exactly what it's going to do. We just know that it's going to do something, and that's why we do it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. To stay connected and for more podcast episodes, follow us on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram at G4Health. See you guys.